Yes, hello. So my name is Sophie Toupin, and I'm from Montreal, Canada, so not too far. And so my presentation today is going to be about anti-colonial hacking. And the subtitle should have been, and it's not there, but it should have been the case study of an autonomous encrypted communication network that was developed during the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So let me start by telling you a story as a means of introduction. So it's October 1988. Janet Love, an Mkhonto MK commander, infiltrated in South Africa, is sitting anonymously in an office in Johannesburg, holding a tape recorder next to a landline phone. Earlier in the morning, she had typed a message from a laptop computer in a safe house. The laptop and the encrypted disk had been infiltrated a few months before by Antoinette, a Dutch flight attendant. After typing her message, she enciphered it and then passed it through the computer's serial port to an acoustic coupler modem. This way, she converted the digital data to sound, and the audio stream was captured on a small cassette tape recorder. She then dialed freedom fighter and hacker Tim Jenkin in London, UK. Jenkin received a message on his answering machine and played the audio message back through a similar acoustic coupler modem attached to his computer to convert it back to digital. The digital data was then deciphered using a matching key disk, which made the plain text appear on Jenkin's computer screen. The message read, "All is fine. Safe houses have been established securely. I have recruited one new trusted person to work under my command. She will be working out of Durban. I might need more money to buy new equipment. Can you send expediently?" Jenkin quickly passed the message on to Lusaka in Zambia, to the exiled senior leadership of the African National Congress, the ANC, the party of Mandela. And at the Lusaka receiving end, Lucia, a Dutch anti-apartheid activist, received Jenkin's enciphered message, deciphered it, printed it out, and a foot courier picked it up, brought it to the senior ANC member for a decision to be taken. So this case study shed light on one of the most exciting but untold story of what I call anti-colonial hacking. It is the story of an anti-apartheid activists, including freedom fighter and hacker Tim Jenkin, who, in exile in London in the beginning of the 1980s, crafted an autonomous encrypted communication network that would end up being part of Operation Vula. The network enabled operatives infiltrated on the ground in South Africa to report back and communicate secretly to and with the African National Congress exiled in Zambia. So this communication network was born at a time where and when the personal computer was just emerging, when cryptography was still seen as a weapon by many countries, the crypto wars had not yet happened, and when countries such as the United States were boycotting South Africa's sale of computer, among other the goods, as they were deemed to support apartheid by providing automation capabilities. Operation Vula was launched in 1985 after decades of struggles that failed to destructure and ultimately dismantle the oppressive white supremacist regime in place since 1948. Operation Vula aimed to put an end to the apartheid regime by bringing covertly South African ANC senior leadership to foster a people's war. Operation Vula, meaning opening the path or the road in Zulu, was envisaged at a time when liberation from apartheid seemed to be beyond reach. The many setbacks of the ANC and of the Mkhonto the independent military wing of the ANC, had faced seemed to render the fall of apartheid less and less of a reality. ANC and MK operatives were being forced in exile, were arrested, were jailed, were tortured, were killed. As the ANC Technical Committee experimentation with automating encryption seemed promising in supporting the ANC cause, it was deemed worthy to be tried and integrated in Operation Vula. The autonomous encrypted communication network, which evolved in refinement over time, had to use heterogeneous forms of technologies and communication devices to adjust to a reality on the ground at a time where the internet, as we know it, did not yet exist. So in my presentation, I will first focus on the South African background to contextualize the reason why an encrypted autonomous communication network was set up, the long history of the ANC in setting up different forms of technological and communication system to share and distribute information, in addition to communicate strategic information across borders, is important to understand on a communication and technological continuum. So the ANC had used radio broadcast, newspapers, leaflet bombs, which I'm going to explain later on, among others, as a way to inform, trigger activism, and keep hope with South Africans who were experiencing oppression on a day-to-day basis. Moreover, the high level of police infiltration within the movement and the burdensome task of handwritten cryptography within the movement are two other factors that need to be grasped to understand the future interest of Operation Vula with programming and cryptographic tools. So the fact that the ANC leadership was in exile, often based in London, and the UK, or Zambia, or elsewhere, made communication, as you can imagine, fairly difficult. And as surveillance of phone calls, snail mails, leaflets, radio broadcast was ubiquitous by the Apartheid regime, whether in South Africa or elsewhere, the ANC could not fully rely on such means of communication to share and exchange strategic information. So if I have time, because maybe my presentation is going to be a bit longer than 50 minutes, but we'll see. I'm hoping to shed light on what I mean by anti-colonial hacking. And I will propose and discuss 4 values or 4 characteristics that characterize the autonomous encrypted communication network developed during the anti-apartheid struggle. And these values will be explored somewhat in relation to contemporary forms of crypto activism impelled by the WikiLeaks and the Edward Snowden's revelation of mass surveillance. The history of cryptography had, until now, strong Western and American groundings. So while acknowledging the importance of this history, am I mentioning this? Oops, I'm going to pass, it through a little bit fast. The radio, just to go back a little bit, you see Imkonto Wesizwe means the spear of the nation. So this was a graphic that was used to show the power of radio, of pirate radio, what we could call today kind of forms of community radio. And we see that the antenna is actually the spear of the nation. So in a sense, this graphic, this image is conveying the power that radio has. And so I think it's a beautiful image. The history of cryptography has, as I was saying, until now, a strong Western and American groundings. And while acknowledging the importance of this history to the crypto movement today, I will nonetheless argue that the example of the autonomous encrypted communication network comes to enrich the history of hacking and cryptography by highlighting its anti-colonial nature and the necessary assemblage of technologies to adapt to a specific context and under very difficult conditions. So while I believe that the concept of anti-colonial hacking might somewhat open up a new field of investigation, I still maintain that the practice is inscribed in hacking practices. So its sensitivities, however, are informed by particular political, liberation, and resistance contexts and conditions. And such sensitivities brings visibility to a field, hacking, that has long been dominated by a certain form of understanding of the practice, located particularly in the Western world, and at times, obviously not always, but sometimes through libertarian perspective. So the set of values also that are projected on and about Africa is one that needs redress. So the continent of Africa is a site of constant resistance to past and present pillaging by the West, in particular and against the neo-colonial narrative that has legitimized its exploitation. So it is my hope that by using the term anti-colonial hacking, it helps somewhat redress the visible imbalances and the contribution that the practice and the nascent research on the practice has afforded to the continent and its people. So let me say just a very few words on my methodology, because this research is based on ethnographic research that I've been doing and that I'm continuing doing. So basically the bulk of the research is based on primary and secondary material, academic articles and biographies and personal accounts, and also African National Congress archives, among others. But in order to bring the voices of those who have been instrumental in creating, operating, and using the encrypted communication network, I have also conducted interviews, and these are a few people that I have conducted interviews with. But obviously these people, there are other people that were also involved, obviously, in the encrypted network. Some of them, unfortunately, have died. Some of them are fairly old, and some of them are because of their old age, they're sick. So I have interviewed Tim Jenkin, I would say probably the main developer of the encrypted communication system, and I'm keeping regular communication with him. And Tim Jenkin also designed a system with Ronnie Press. Ronnie Press passed away, but Ronnie Press was a chemistry professor who was in exile as well in London. And I have interviewed Janet Love, who was an Operation Vula communication officer and also an Inkonto Westiswe commander. She was a kick-ass woman. And I have also interviewed Lucia, who is a Dutch national and who was basically based in Lusaka, Zambia, and was receiving the communications that came from the system. So let me tell you a little bit about the background so that you have a better idea of where we're located, but what also are the conditions under which the system, kind of unraveled. So the ban of the African National Congress and the Sharpeville massacre of 1960 led many ANC and MK activists to flee South Africa. Having no ANC leaders on the ground to propel, to organize and strengthen local resistance, would later be recognized as the raison d'être of Operation Vula in order to change the state of affairs. And despite this context, the ANC was nonetheless sending a few well-trained operatives underground to make the ANC and its cause visible. And so one of these operatives was Tim Jenkin, who at the time were about mid-1970s. Tim Jenkin was in his he was a late 20-year-old tech-savvy person. And before his political consciousness was raised, which later pushed him to be involved with the ANC, Jenkin had no idea of the brutality of the apartheid regime, despite having grown up in South Africa. In his book, Escape from Pretoria, he talks about the difficulty for white South Africans to break free of the web of privilege and racism, and how through the intellectual route he was able to see the light, as he says. So after working clandestinely in Cape Town for about 2 years, printing and distributing ANC material, he was arrested in 1978 and convicted to 12 years in prison under terrorist charges. And so he was jailed for leaflet bombing, which is an explosive device that would do no harm to people, but would simply launch in the air pamphlets. And he was, taught to build this little explosive device by the ANC Technical Committee to wake up South Africans to the ANC cause. And so as soon as he was jailed, he told himself that he wanted to escape. And so in a meticulously planned escape doing lockpicking, so for those who are hackers or go once in a while to a hacker conference, there will be a workshop on lockpicking. So he basically used lockpicking to escape from Pretoria prison with 2 other white political prisoners, and basically 1.5 years after being convicted. And so he escaped by making wooden keys. So 10 sets of different wooden keys that would enable him and others to open the 10 different doors that he needed to go through to escape. So by itself, this is a remarkable story. There's a documentary that was done by the National Geographic documentary something that is on the web. And so if you look for Escape from Pretoria, you're going to see it. It's unbelievable, really unbelievable. So when he escaped from prison, he took refuge in London, UK. So we're, around 1980, like time-wise. And so he became one of the trainers for underground work and covert operations. And at the same time, and as part of the technical committee, Tim Jenkins and Ronnie Press started experimenting with programming and cryptography on some of the first affordable computers in Britain. And until the beginning of the 1980s, the ANC did not rely on any sophisticated and effective communication network. It often used courier to travel in and out of the country to bring instructions, and often women were actually couriers because they were less seen as being, potentially identified as a courier. So it was easier for them to navigate. And also, as maybe a parenthesis, you've seen so far, there's a lot of women involved in this story, so which is really great. It also, it often used courier, as I was saying, and who travel in and out of the country to bring instructions, to bring banned literature and pamphlets, and also use Radio Freedom, or the ANC radio, as we've seen earlier, to convey messages of revolutionary narrative, basically. And so the ANC also resorted to plain old handwritten cryptography, but this form of communication was really demanding time-wise, and very few operatives on the ground were actually using it. And so the difficulty in and time required to exchange secure communication, as you can imagine, changed drastically when Tim and Ronnie Press system was put together. So Jenkins said in the first ever account of the encrypted communication network, and so he said, "It is astonishing that so few ANC leaders were able to see this, the need for secure communication network, as communications is the most important weapon in any conflict situation. The purchase of our first computer led to a revolution in our communications that ultimately made possible operations such as Vula." And to come up with the encrypted communication network, Jenkins and Press experimented with a multitude of technologies, from paging devices to touchstones to modems to public and landline phones to tape recorders, among others. They also experimented with a small computer that was available at the time, a PX 1000, which allowed for encrypted communication. It worked between the Netherlands and Britain, but it didn't work with South Africa. So they decided not to use that, even though that was available, but it was, deemed not appropriate for the task. So in my introductory words, I kind of, roughly hinted towards how the system worked, but let me, go a little bit deeper on how it actually worked, and I have an infographics that's gonna help you to understand really how the system worked. Top-level cadres who were sent into South Africa, and I think that's important to mention, they were trained by Tim Jenkin, either in London or in Lusaka, were at the beginning of the 1980s. We're like 84, 85, maybe 86. A lot of people had never used a computer before, so training was important. So these cadres then trained others in key operations related to the communication system. And the laptop computers, the encrypted programs, essential equipment, and key disks were infiltrated, as I was earlier saying, by Antoinette, this Dutch flight attendant, who regularly flew from Amsterdam to Johannesburg. So basically, she was a mule. So she was bringing in material. And at that time, there was the crew in flights were not checked. So you could, just take a flight and not be, searched, which really helped, because today I don't think that would be possible. Let me a little bit zoom in, because this is a little small. To send a message from South Africa, the user would type a message on a laptop. So you see the laptop over there. And encipher it and then pass it through, as I was saying earlier, the computer serial port to the acoustic coupler modem. So for those who haven't seen, don't really know what an acoustic coupler modem looks like. So it's just, it's like a phone that is, hooked up on something like solid. And so this converted the digital data to sound. And so the audio stream was captured on the tape recorder. And so the user would take on the B side, tape recorder and bring it to an office and dial Tim Jenkin in London. And so in London, Tim Jenkin had a special answering machine attached to it to receive the messages. So if Jenkin was traveling, so that's the Amsterdam connection, and so if Jenkin was traveling, instruction would be given to dial Ronnie Press backup number in London. And Jenkin and Press Flat were connected, as you can see, by first a bulletin board system, so they could be like regularly in contact, and also as a backup by radio link. So it was, a very well thought system. So the received audio message was then stored on the London receive answering machine, and Jenkin or Press would then reverse the process by playing the received audio messages back through a similar acoustic coupler modem attached to their computers to convert it back to digital. And so the digital data would be deciphered using a matching key disk, and the deciphered message would then appear as plain text on the computer screen and could be printed for archiving or stored with another encryption program. And so the London operators would analyze each message to determine which item had to be passed on to Lusaka and which item were for other destinations. Canada was a link, Zimbabwe was another link, the Netherlands was another link, and which one could be dealt with by London. And so when there were messages for South Africa from London, the procedure and the protocol changed a little bit. So the operative who the message were for would be page. So that's where the pager comes in. with a code indicating how many messages there were to pick up. And the operative would then go to a public phone and dial a different number in London to access the send answering machine. And the messages to be received were played as outgoing messages by the answering machine and recorded by the operative onto the small cassette tape recorder by placing a special microphone on the earpiece of the telephone. And the recorded messages would be taken home, where they were played back into the laptop via the acoustic coupler modem and deciphered. So the initial arrangement in Lusaka, so now we're in Zambia, worked in much the same way, but without having to use public telephones. Lucia, who received enciphered messages, deciphered them and print them out. And as I was earlier saying, so there would be a courier that would come and pick up the messages and bring them to the ANC leadership. And then they would decide what to do with the message that they received. And messages for London were likewise left on a separate receive answering machine. And later, a more advanced bulletin board system was used. A dedicated computer in London was used for both depositing and receiving messages. So the encrypted communication network was fully operational between July 1988 until 1991, so for about 3 years. And it was discovered by accident, by a complete fluke, by the South African police in 1990, in July 1990. But then when Jenkins heard of this, he rapidly changed the keys, which allowed it to continue operating for 1 more year. And so when infiltrated Operation Vula got amnesty in June 1991, and here as a timeline, I think it's important to say that Mandela was released from prison in February 1990, so just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so the fall of the USSR, first led to, one of the many reasons why Mandela was released, but also why also the Operation Vula were also released. And it was, as I said, June 1991, there was negotiation that were started, or that were, in continuation with the South African government. And so the autonomous communication network started to wind down in, as I said, in late 1991. So in total, about 10 top-level cadres used the autonomous encrypted communication system, so very few people used it. Although there were others who were performing minor roles, such as relaying and receiving messages from public telephones. And, but it is through the tinkering with many different technologies that Jenkins and Press slowly built a technological assemblage that would come to compose this encrypted communication network. And over the years, Jenkins would continue to improve his cryptographic skills, refining the algorithm that he used. He basically used a one-time pad, the automation of a one-time pad. So he would end up conceiving a means of encrypted communication system despite the local challenging context. And the users, the operative, sent into South Africa, and those who would be receiving and sending the messages from Lusaka would also play an important role in creating the conditions to make the best use of the encrypted communication network. Except, however, as I said earlier, when the communication network was accidentally discovered by the South African police. So what is significant with this chapter of history is that some historical records show that handwritten cryptography has been used by other African liberation movements, particularly in the case of Angola. But it appears that Tim Jenkins and Ronnie Press' autonomous encrypted communication network might have been the first of its kind developed by and for an African liberation struggle movement, making this example at the heart of anti-colonial hacking. And so let me now gesture briefly towards anti-colonial hacking. So I refer to anti-colonial hacking in very general and broad terms to start with, basically as a practice that uses technological skills, including programming and crypto skills, as part of a liberation or a decolonization movement that aims to fight colonialism in all its forms, including apartheid, but it also goes further than that. And it's not only the people who were involved in this quest that define what anti-colonial hacking is. I also gesture towards anti-colonial hacking sensibilities as a way to question the Western narrative of technology and how it disrupts, in a sense, the modernity thesis. So the encrypted communication network had a clear political intent, which was about supporting an anti-colonial struggle. The system was created at a time where technology, and particularly computers, were used by the regime in place, by the apartheid regime in place, as a tool of surveillance, control, and structured violence that reinforced apartheid. Not only people were under constant surveillance through different technological regime, but also, and laws, but also communication and information outlets, whether by radio, TV, newspapers, books, etc., were controlled, and laws were implemented to restrict freedom of the press and the right to communicate. So the state and intelligence apparatus were also monitoring, tracking, and surveying underground means of communications. So freedom fighters in exile within Great Britain, in the Netherlands, in Canada, in the US, elsewhere, were constantly under surveillance and constantly spied on. So I propose to examine 4 values or characteristics that come to embody the autonomous encrypted communication network. And so while I don't suggest that these values embody what exactly anti-colonial hacking means, as they are very specific to this case study, they nonetheless help inform one example of hacking with anti-colonial political intent. So the first characteristic, political intent. The first characteristic of the encrypted communication network I want to outline is the political dimension behind this assemblage of technology for the purpose of liberation. So while the South African government used technology to try to automate apartheid and create a narrative of progress and modernity around their use of technology to set them aside from the rest of the African continent, those resisting the regime in place were creating this assemblage of technology that supported a different understanding of technology, one that aimed at liberation. And so this political intent is somewhat distinct but also somewhat linked to the sanctity of the right to privacy and freedom of expression that drives many hacking and encryption projects today. So, second characteristic or value, autonomous infrastructure. And I'm going to dwell a little bit more onto this characteristic. So the encrypted communication network rests on the experiences and the mastering of technological means of production by freedom fighters. This allowed to create something new through this assemblage of technologies. And the freedom fighters and hackers were not only creating a system from the ground up, they were also hacking the dominant stance of the apartheid understanding of modernity and technology. So autonomy is, of course, relative. And the system developed by Jenkins and Press resided on using technology that already existed, phones, tapes recorders, the international telephone network, etc. And created an assemblage that repurposed the technology used and in turn opened up new possibilities. So autonomy is also related to the non-commercial aspect of the developed technology. So in relation to this, Jenkins made it clear from the start that this initiative was not intended for commercial use. the technological assemblage that they put together was beyond the simple idea of innovating for innovating or to make profit. It was about facilitating the secure communication of a small group of people to make an operation such as Vula possible. The autonomous aspect of the communication system was not based on a commercial algorithm or commercial option to encrypt one's communications. It was based on an algorithm that had been designed by Jenkins. So when Jenkins developed his algorithm, around mid-80s, the Diffie-Hellman, the DH, and the RSA, Rivet-Shamir-Edelman algorithms already existed, but few outside a very confined crowd knew about these important developments in strong crypto. And just to let you know, so if you're using PGP, you're using RSA algorithm. If you're using OTR through ADM or else, you're using Diffie-Hellman and among other algorithms. But just to situate you in terms of the algorithms that are being used by the technologies today. So both MIT, there's RSA was developed by 3 mathematicians at MIT. So the Rivet-Shamir-Edelman are the 3 mathematicians from MIT that created RSA. And Stanford DH, Diffie and Hellman are two guys that are associated with Stanford University. So both of these institutions had patented the discovery of their mathematicians, and both groups had put together companies to sell their products with a profit aim. And before the algorithms fell into the public realm fairly recently, about 15 years ago, roughly, whoever wanted to use them needed to pay for its use. So compare with the work of the academics and the mathematicians who designed the DH and the RSA, the goal of Tim Jenkins and his compatriots was not, to patent their device. The project was not based on scientific curiosity or came from a hobbyist passion. Their goal was specific. They were working around the clock to come up with devices and an assemblage of technology which would help the ANC cause. So their struggle through technical means permitted a level of agency which was a response against the brutal conditions in which people in South Africa and those in exile live. The creation of this network was inscribed in somewhat of a different sets of values. So, as I said, to create the conditions for liberating a people from a white supremacist regime, state. And in fact, when the apartheid regime collapsed and was replaced by a democratically elected state, the autonomous encrypted communication network stopped being used. And now the third characteristic is technological literacy and trainings. So as computers and cryptography were largely new in the 1980s, technological literacy and trainings was paramount for the well-functioning of the encrypted communication network, as many had never used computer before. So in talking about the training dimension, Jenkins said in an interview that I conducted in June of this year, 19th of June, as this was the 1980s, very few people had much experience with computers. This made the training quite difficult for some, as they had to learn the basics before they could even get to the encryption program. So the selection of users was not based on the basis of experience, but on the basis of need. Those comrades who were going to be on the front line and who needed to communicate with the ANC leadership were the ones who were required to learn how to operate the comms equipment. And moreover, in a context like Lusaka, Zambia, electricity was not a given. The quality of the telephone line and the downtime in telephone service were all impediments to the well-functioning of the autonomous encrypted communication system. So one of its operator, that I talked about earlier, Lucia, based in Lusaka, said to highlight the difficulties met with handling the system and the ingenuity of those who crafted it. So she said, there had been a fire in an electricity substation, and I was without electricity during the day for almost a year. Again, this meant going to somebody else's house to send and receive encrypted messages, but this was not sustainable. So Tim Jenkins configured the IT system to run off a car battery, and he came to install it. So one of the main challenges, however, experienced by operatives on the ground was about the time it took to send a message via the system. So while the time has been considerably reduced from handwritten cryptography, it still took time to send messages. So Janet Love recalls, the main challenge was to send encrypted data using normal telecommunication facilities. Firstly, it took a hell of a long time. It was quite obtrusive. If you can imagine somebody sitting at a phone with this equipment trying to get the data to communicate into the phone, and often not happening, and finally having the data go through. So basically, it took between 1 and 2 hours to send one message. So it still, required quite a significant time compared to today, obviously. So the last value or characteristic that I want to highlight, because obviously there could be more, is the role of women. So the struggle against apartheid in South Africa saw many women involved in a variety of roles and tasks. And while a few numbers were MK commanders, many were involved in courier and communication-related work. In A Dying Colonialism, Frantz Fanon highlights that women were performing tasks that were often impossible for men to perform as they attracted less attention. And though the main leaders of Operation Vula and those who crafted the communication system were men, many women came to operate and to use the encrypted communication system and were thus crucial in its functioning. Because we can have a great system that is in place, but if you don't have any people to operate it, then you have a problem. So you have to recognize the independence of these two entities. So this is reminiscent of the story of the ENIAC girls who set up and operated the world's first electronic computer in the United States. And at that time, since programming was seen as a low-level task, it was seen as being perfect for women. In The Computer Boys Take Over, in Merger, it's a great book, by the way, so Computer Boys Take Over, I recommend it highly. So he traces the history of the ENIAC girls and their importance in developing the early field of programming. And he shows that making this history visible was crucial, basically showing that women were at the core of software programming in the 1950s. But this history is often, we rarely hear about it. And so we need to constantly remind ourselves that this history, happened. And now, because there are so few women that are involved in programming or in cryptography, this history is important, right? Because, many need role models. So we need more women. In conclusion, and my conclusion is going to be short, but the encrypted communication network that was set up as part of the ANC endeavor to bring about an end to the apartheid regime in South Africa is a cornerstone example of the use of hacking in an anti-colonial setting. By shedding light to this hidden chapter of history, my presentation and a paper that will ensue aims at giving credit to a continent of the world, Africa, that is often eclipsed from the limelight of technical innovation and hackerdom. So thank you. So if you have any questions, comments.
I have one right away, which is the ENIAC programmers you were just talking about at the end. There's a new short film called The Computers by Kathy Kleiman. If you go to ENIACprogrammers.org, I think it is, you'll find it's I've seen it. It's a great movie. It's very short. It's made to put into schools. So if you know any computer science teachers, turn them onto it, they can get it for their school.
Fantastic, thank you. If you have other great comments like this, please don't hesitate, right? Okay.
The audio quality on the phone lines, was there any problem with having the computers be able to receive it? And what sort of protocol were they using for it? Because there's the time delay, it's not like having two modems talk to each other that can, if they don't receive a packet, they can repeat.
Right, that's a very good question. From the interviews that I made with Tim Jenkins, apparently there was not, there was so much testing going on that at the end there was, sometimes the messages would not go through, and that's why it took 1 to 2 hours to send. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer was that sometimes there were some bits of messages that would not go through, but they were able to make up what the message was all about, even if like a word or two were missing. But it's a really great question. So far I haven't really entered in like really the technical part of the system. Well, obviously, like I've shown how it works. So like at the technical level, I understand how it works. But the real details, I still need to investigate that. But it's a great question.
I was wondering if you have any examples of anti-colonial hacking in modern context.
That's a good question. I'm actually looking for other examples, particularly with indigenous people. And so far I haven't. It's not as if I've looked really deeply. It actually took me 2 years to find this case study. So I'm not joking. So it takes a lot of time to make the research, and it's about reading. So it's reading academic articles, but it's not only because often this is not investigated by academics. So you need to fetch it elsewhere. You need to talk to people. So it's a really long process. I'm hoping that they exist. It's just maybe that I'm not aware of it. But my sense is that it exists. Like in Western Sahara, I'm wondering maybe something of the sort exists. Like in Palestine, maybe something of the sort exists. Like in other, and also obviously during the decolonization period of the 1990s in Africa or elsewhere. But more research needs to be done on this point. And like something that I've come across is that Fidel Castro and Che Guevara used handwritten cryptography to talk to one another. So they were using like one-time pads. And so, of course, that was, in the 50s, so that, dates back from a long time. But they were using, handwritten cryptography. So handwritten cryptography has been used by many resistance movements, which, in my kind of sense of what anti-colonial hacking means, that would also, be part of it. But it would be it would not necessarily be the automation of the system. So it would just be, another kind of cryptographic system. So.
Do you have a sense for how many people knew about this system who were in the resistance movement, and how many people on each end actually sent and received messages directly? I know that the messages, eventually got out to a larger group of people, but
right.
How big was that collection?
Very, very small. So roughly, when I asked the question to Tim Jenkins, he said that 10 people were involved. In the actual, making and operation of and using the system. So it was, in a sense, very confined to a few people, but that was to avoid any kind of infiltration possible. So that's why they kept it to so few people. Apart from that, there was the ANC leadership. Some of the ANC leadership knew about it. Nelson Mandela came to use it twice, I believe, when he was in prison. But he didn't use the encrypted system per se because he was in prison. But there was messages that were sent to him, and then he replied by by writing something on a piece of paper, and someone was successful in bringing this message that he had written and write it on a computer to send the message to Lusaka, Zambia. And that was at a time when there was some, the ANC was negotiating with the apartheid regime in place. So the apartheid regime thought that it was actually negotiating only with Nelson Mandela, but Nelson Mandela was also relaying some information to the ANC leadership. So that's, yeah. So any other questions or comments or?
I'm wondering about that, the weak points on, obviously there was a phone call made from South Africa to London, right? But there was never any surveillance of the phone lines that allowed people to catch that. I mean, obviously there's this phone call being made and there was an awful lot of strange noises going across it for a long time. And the other part of that, I don't know if that had anything to do with the apartheid government stumbling across the system, as you said. But when that happened, was there any consideration of using that to the benefit? As in knowing that the enemy that you could send false messages that maybe the enemy thinks are correct through that system?
Right.
Is there any consideration of exploiting that?
Yeah, so the first part of the question, I still need to figure that out in the sense that did, for instance, the UK government, did the American government knew about this system? Because there was a lot of, well, Tim Jenkins' house was a hacker space. There was like so many computers in his apartment. And he was receiving like so many messages. So was there a hint there? So I'm not sure if the UK government knew about it. I'm not sure if the US government knew about it. I would need to do to file a information request. That's something that I'm planning on doing. But from the South African end, because they were so baffled when they discovered that the system existed, they didn't really know what to do, right? And they didn't know that this was happening, and I don't think they thought at that time that they could potentially, use the system to send false messages. But also in terms, time-wise, the apartheid regime was almost being, negotiations were happening. So maybe if the system would have happened earlier, maybe this would have been a consideration from the apartheid regime. But at that time, and that's also one of the reasons why the system has gone kind of off record, because there was so many things happening in 1991 that the system was not, it was not the main. It was important, but it was not that important anymore. So activists were actually trying to organize, to have democratically elected elections. So I'm kind of, not like totally answering your question, but at the same time I have, bits and pieces of information and lacking many of it as well. So, yeah.
One of the possible examples in North America would perhaps be the Zapatista movement, like the Lions in Mexico, who had an uprising against the Mexican state in the 90s, but then lost militarily, and they switched strategy completely using the internet as a way to raise awareness for their cause, and in that sense managed to push their agenda. So that might be something to look into.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm truly, you know, I'm aware of the Zapatista movement. Like for me, growing up, it was a very important resistance point that actually, you know, pushed me to be involved in indie media. I'm not sure. I would need to think about it a bit more to see if I would categorize that as anti-colonial hacking. But I think it's interesting to definitely. It's a great example, obviously. Like it's a wonderful example, and it's an amazing struggle that happened. But yeah.
I mean, why they're interesting is because it's it's like the first conscious use of technical media from anti-colonial movement using these new platforms such as the web.
Yeah, definitely, because they were resisting one of the was it not the FTA, but one of the trade agreements.
Yeah, the NAFTA.
Yeah, the NAFTA. Thank you. Yeah, agreement. Yeah. So yeah, I guess in that sense, yeah. I don't know. So that's a good example. Yeah, Rebecca.
I'm not sure if it's been mentioned before, but I guess a new way of anti-colonial hacking could be like the use that ISIS makes of digital media, and how the way to carry messages are not particularly technical, but at least propaganda, and the way to make them go from one country to another is to broadcast them through those channels that are already so open, such as Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, carrying their messages to advance a particular cause that's anti-American, anti-Western. I don't know if you would categorize that.
I personally would not. But yeah, I personally would not. I don't see this. Yeah, I don't see ISIS as.
But it's still making use of particular tools to subvert a message.
Right, for sure. But it's not for a liberation purpose. It's not to bring, you know, a form of.
From their perspective, maybe. I mean.
Yeah, but then I think we need to, you know, cross the line, and I think my line is, you know, an apartheid regime was completely like not acceptable. But what ISIS is doing is also completely unacceptable. And so for me, this is not a liberation movement. It's absolutely not. But this, you know, so.
But isn't that weird if you have like a Western person saying your struggle is valid and the other one isn't?
Well, then you enter into cultural relativism, right? And personally, I need to put my own limits, and these are my boundaries. These are my limits, right? And that's, you know, the concept that I'm putting forth, anti-colonial hacking, is, like in my understanding, isn't within certain boundaries. But of course, other people can use, you know, the concept and bring it, you know, to highlight other examples. But I would be cautious about this. Yeah, but yeah. So if there's no further questions, thank you.